When the city of Fasher in Sudan fell to the Rapid Support Forces paramilitaries in late October, the group gained control of the entire Darfur region and areas to the southwest. Their rivals, the Sudanese armed forces, control the capital Khartoum, as well as the northern, eastern, and central areas. The fear now is that the country could be divided as the fighting rages on for a third year. But the Sudan war is not only one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. It's also in danger of becoming a global war, drawing foreign interests from various countries, with accusations, claims, and counterclaims leveled at Egypt, the UAE, Iran, and Saudi Arabia of having a stake in supporting different sides. From the influence of armed groups, militias, and the Muslim Brotherhood to the smuggling of arms and people, this is a humanitarian crisis with major strategic ramifications. Meanwhile, on the ground, it's the civilians who suffer the most. Mass atrocities have been reported that may amount to war crimes, and famine has been declared in parts of the country. So what will it take to end this brutal and senseless conflict? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we look at the unimaginable humanitarian situation in the aftermath of Fasher's fall and ask, will the warring parties ever agree to concede their power and realize that a military solution is not on the table? Testimonies of people fleeing Fasher in recent weeks tell a story of horror as they try to find safety in the nearby town of Tawila, about 60 kilometers away. Shashwat Saraf, NRC Sudan country director, is there now. I ask him how people are describing the situation on the ground.
Over the last 1 week, we have seen more than 7,000 people who've arrived into Tawila from Fasher. What we hear as testimonies from most of the people who are coming into Tawila is that they are seeing dead bodies on the road. They've seen people being killed in Fasher, but they've also seen people being killed outside Fasher. One of the mothers who had just arrived said that she actually does not know where her 3-year-old child is, because when she started running, there were a lot of bullets flying all around. The 3-year-old child was on the shoulder of her husband. And by the time she escaped, she ran and she looked around. She could not see her husband and child. She still does not know where her husband and 3-year-old child is. And she started weeping. And this is not just one story. These are testimonies that we are hearing from every single person who's arriving into Tawila. So what we are hearing is really horrific. We are very scared and afraid of the hundreds of thousands of people who still are either in Fasher or are in some other towns very close to Fasher and are not able to move to safer locations like Tawila.
They're not able to move anywhere safe. Why are they trapped?
One reason why they are trapped in different locations is because they fear that when they are moving on the road, they can be killed or they can again be detained or kidnapped and held hostage. We've heard from some people who arrived that when they were about to reach Tawila, they were once again held hostage, they were bound, they were beaten, they were asked for money. A few of them managed to escape, but they mentioned that there are still many who have been detained and are under hostage. We've even heard that some people have had to crawl on their elbows in the sand in desert so that they are not spotted and targeted. The second reason why they are not able to move is because they are being asked to pay to move and to leave those locations, to move to places like Tawila. And they don't. They don't have the resources. They have nothing with them to be able to move out.
Even before Fasher fell to the RSF paramilitaries, it had already been under siege. Along with other parts of Sudan, the Hunger Monitor has determined that there's a famine there. Can you tell us how food and other supplies have been prevented from reaching people? Why are people going hungry?
So in Fasher itself, the siege lasted for close to 18 months. There was very limited supply of food going into Fasher, but also very limited room for people to leave Fasher and come out because of the siege. Whatever was available was not affordable because the prices were very high and people could not afford that. When the city was under siege, we had heard from people telling us that they are boiling leaves and eating. We had even heard about people surviving on animal feed because there wasn't anything available other than that. There was already famine in Fasher. There was already hunger. And I think going back to one of the questions which you asked as to why are people trapped, there are many people, especially children and mothers with children who are not able to move because they have gone through this spate of hunger over the last many weeks and months. And they don't really have the energy to make this arduous journey from where they are all the way to Tawila.
I'm really sorry that we have to explore such a variety of violations and atrocities, but there have also been reports of sexual assault. How are women and girls especially vulnerable in this conflict? As we know, they are the most vulnerable in any conflict.
That's the terrible part of any conflict, and particularly of this conflict in Sudan, is that we have seen gender-based violence, we've seen sexual violence. It's very difficult to know the scale of it, but yes, we know from specialized organizations who provide care, who provide support to the survivors of sexual violence and gender-based violence, that there are multiple cases that are coming in amongst the new arrivals, but there have also been cases before. Currently in Tawila, there are more than 600,000 internally displaced people. Tawila itself right now is one big open air IDP camp. In April this year, close to 500,000 people had to flee Zamzam camp and some other locations from Fasher locality and come to Tawila. So there are numerous cases of sexual and gender-based violence that have been reported and that are being managed by specialized organizations. It's terrible. It's terrible.
The problem is that it's taking us so long to actually cover all the different types of terrible that this is. UN humanitarian chief Tom Fletcher has warned of children being forcibly recruited to kill each other. What can you tell us about that?
Children suffer the most when it comes to conflicts such as these. They suffer in the form of separation from their families, of being orphans. We have seen numerous children coming into Tawila who are unaccompanied children as young as 3 years old to 16 years old who don't know where their parents are, where their grandparents are, where their siblings are, even if they are alive or not. We haven't investigated around child soldiers and recruitment of child soldiers, but we do know and we've heard of secondary schools that have been targeted where children have been asked to join, and a lot of children actually crossing the border into Chad just to avoid being recruited as a child soldier.
And it's not that just the civilians, the humanitarians are also at risk. How are aid workers operating in these conditions and these areas where, yes, they're needed the most, but they're still at risk?
I think the biggest or aid workers who are at risk are the local responders, the local response groups who came together to support people around them by running community kitchens, by providing healthcare, by providing the support. And we've seen that there have been targeting of local responders, local response groups. In addition to that, international NGO workers have been targeted. As of now, we are in Tawila, but we are unable to go into locations where we should be. We should be providing humanitarian assistance in locations where people are trapped. But we are not able to do it because the roads are not safe. We do fear for the safety and security of our own staff and colleagues. And that's why we feel very helpless in some ways that we are sitting and waiting for people to come to Tawila to access humanitarian assistance, whereas it's our responsibility to go out and reach and respond to the needs where people are and where the needs are.
If the warring parties do not come to a ceasefire, is there a fear that the humanitarian situation is going to deteriorate further, not just in Al-Fasher, but to spread even beyond that?
You know, it's interesting that you asked this because as of now, we are already talking about close to 33 million people in Sudan who are in need. We are talking about 22 million who are completely food insecure. We are talking about 13 million children who are out of school. We are talking about 10 million people who have had to abandon everything, their homes, their lives, and are living in camps across Sudan. And then we have additional 3 million people who have had to flee Sudan to neighboring countries in Chad, in South Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, Libya. So we are already talking about millions of people. So I wonder as to how much further can we see the situation deteriorate than what it already is today.
In Sudan, the Quad Initiative provides a robust framework to end the devastating conflict and pave the way for a permanent ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian access, and a transition to an independent civilian government.
That's the UAE's Anwar Gargash, diplomatic advisor to President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, speaking at the Abu Dhabi Strategic Debates this week. The UAE is one of the countries that form what's been dubbed the Quad, along with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the US. They have come up with a proposal to end the conflict. Mr. Gargash says that diplomacy, not military action, must be the common denominator to resolve all conflicts across the region. Last week, the RSF in principle agreed to a US proposed humanitarian ceasefire in Sudan, and the Sudanese armed forces has yet to agree. So what happens next? I discussed this with the National's editor-in-chief, Mina Al-Oraibi. Mina, everyone seems to be referring to the Quad statement as some sort of roadmap for peace. What is this Quad statement, and what can you tell us about it, particularly that both sides of this conflict seem to think that it can be won militarily?
So the Quad references 4 countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the US. And they have been meeting for quite some time to try to work diplomatically at resolving the war in Sudan. And the Quad most recently met on a ministerial level on the 12th of September 2025. So this was just before the UN General Assembly meeting. And they issued a joint statement. It was really important. They had all 4 sides agree on the statement. And basically the statement has become a roadmap from the 4 countries that can have the most influence on this issue, saying that first, Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity are essential for peace and stability. It starts with that statement, which is very important because unity, territorial integrity, that tackles the issue of some people are saying is one side, be it the UAE, be it Egypt, be it Saudi Arabia, be it the US, pushing to try to divide Sudan. So they come out clearly and say, we believe in territorial integrity. Second, they say there's no viable military solution to the conflict, and the status quo creates unacceptable suffering and risks to peace and security. And the statement goes on, but it's important because in diplomacy, it's very important when you have these moments and markers of saying, this is the basis, the blueprint, the ethos of what these countries are now going to work towards diplomatically with the actors on the ground. They've all committed to putting in efforts to support a negotiated settlement of the conflict with the active participation of the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. These are the main 2 warring parties, and we have to remember there are also smaller splinter groups. And so at least getting the 2 to the table before the need becomes to negotiate with another 30. And then the statement goes on to lay out a roadmap that includes a possible humanitarian ceasefire that lasts 3 months to create the space for a permanent ceasefire and a political solution.
You mentioned this just a moment ago. Now, about the division of Sudan. Now that the RSF has also taken Fasher, there's an idea that perhaps Sudan could be split. Is that where this is all heading? I know that the Quad statement covers that part, but is that a viable solution?
In July 2011, South Sudan declared its independence. Sudan was broken. And at the time, many who advocated for the breakup of Sudan, and that included major countries, European countries that were supporting this effort, It included celebrities like George Clooney and Matt Damon. It included this whole confluence of actors that said, basically, Christian South Sudan should break off. And if you look at the situation in both Sudan and South Sudan today, they are, if not worse off, which Sudan is, they're certainly not in a better place, which is South Sudan. And South Sudan has many, many problems. So does the splitting up of a country solve its problems? No, because what is a war like this about? It is essentially a civil war and a fight over resources and a fight over power.
And territory.
And so if you have this breakup, what happens is that fight becomes internal between the different groups. You need law and order, you need the protection of civilians, and you need a political roadmap of what does this country stand for. And Sudan was close to that. In 2019, with the fall of the Omar al-Bashir government, and it was a revolution, there was a civilian government, and there was the beginnings and the emergence of a future Sudan. Nobody was arguing then that actually West Sudan and East Sudan are two different countries and they shouldn't be together. So it won't solve the killing and it won't solve the problems that Sudan is suffering from. And so there are many Sudanese, including activists and civil society actors, that say that's not what we're calling for. What we're calling for is an end to war, a holding to account everyone that has committed atrocities, which is RSF and SAF and other militant groups, but also external support to try to stabilize the country and allow for good governance, allow, of course, not only for the immediate humanitarian support, but also economic viability, et cetera, for the country. So the fear is that breaking up the country becomes a way for the RSF and the SAF to try to gain territory and influence, say, okay, each one can rule a different country. It is not a viable solution. And none of the countries that are involved in what happens in Sudan are advocating for that, even if members of the SAF and the RSF will claim behind closed doors, oh no, actually, we're getting support to do this. There's no evidence to prove that.
You just mentioned here about the civilian government where things were starting to look up post-Bashir. Then all of that fell apart, obviously, when things got violent and arms were taken. Do you believe that a civilian-led government could be the solution? Because we don't hear the civilian voices in all of this.
The civilian voices always get drowned out when people with guns and tanks can take over. The civilian voices exist very much. I mean, Sudan has a very rich history of civil activism and also really an educated and smart group of people who could rule it. Our colleague Lema Shahada in London just spoke to Khalid Omar Yusuf, who used to be a cabinet minister in the short-lived civilian government after the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, and he said that there is broad support for the Quad statement and for this kind of roadmap on the ground, and he's put together 178 civil society figures to put out and issue a statement calling on the four countries, the Quad countries, to put maximum pressure on the warring parties to come to a roadmap that would allow for civilian rule. It is one of those things that frustrates me the most, that when you have countries at war, people assume that civilian voices don't exist or there aren't ideas. The problem is, sadly, in a war, it does become the person with the most arms that's able to inflict the greatest harm that tries to call the shots. But hopefully, with this kind of international galvanization now around Sudan, there's enough pressure on those parties that forces them to accept a ceasefire and then to come to a political solution.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Ben Merkawi. Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nadal Tahir. For more on this, go to thenationalnews.com. Thank you for listening.